Normal monsters used to look like this. Now they look like this. They're basically irrelevant in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In fact, most players would scoff at the idea of even running a normal monster in their deck. They're bricky, weak, and outdated for how fast the game is now. But the weird thing is, they've still managed to see play time and time again. So today, I've compiled the nearly quarter-century worth of history of normal monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! To see why exactly normal monsters became so irrelevant. With the release of Legend of Blue Eyes, the very first set, normal monsters are the most relevant they've ever been, where the stats on a card remain supreme. With the vast majority of monsters being vanillas, around 90% of the card pool was invalidated. As fun as they are, there was very little reason to run cards like Beaver Warrior and Skull Servant over Skull Red Bird. There were effect monsters in the set, but with only 5 of them available, with the exception of Man-Eater Bug, for most intents and purposes, none of their effects were strong enough to justify running them over the high stat normal monsters. The strongest normal monster in the game at this time was Blue Eyes, boasting by far the best overall stats. Its combination of high attack and defense immediately rendered other high attack vanillas like Dark Magician, Trihorn Dragon, and Gaia the Fierce Knight largely irrelevant, as there was simply no practical reason to run anything else. Gaia did sort of have a small niche, as it was a part of a fusion into Gaia the Dragon Champion, but in reality this amounted to a free card investment for a modest 300 attack increase over Gaia, and even then Blue Eyes still surpassed it in raw stats. Another important group of normal monsters from this period were Aquamador, Giant Soldier of Stone, and Mystical Elf. While their attack points were low, they compensated with relatively high defense. The 2000 defense threshold was especially significant, as it meant that none of the commonly played level 4 beaters could run over them. As a result, these monsters were valuable defensive tools, used either to stall the opponent's aggression, or to buy time to set up tribute summons for higher level monsters. And of course, there was also the release of the game's very first alternate win condition.
Exodia! Obliterate!
Exodia was notable because it offered the first way to win outside of the normal rules of reducing an opponent's life points to 0. If a player managed to assemble all 5 pieces in their hand, they would immediately win the game. While Exodia benefited from strong name recognition thanks to its prominence in the anime, it struggled in actual competitive play due to the extremely limited card pool. Exodia was not a set of cards that could be casually splashed into other strategies. Decks had to be built entirely around it. Any attempt to split focus between the conventional beatdown plan and Exodia would simply result in a pile of individually weak cards that did very little on their own. The only realistic way to play Exodia at this time was as a stall strategy, aiming to drag the game out long enough to draw all 5 pieces. However, with only a real single draw card available in the entire game, Exodia never emerged as a truly viable strategy in this early format. It's also important to remember that not only was Yu-Gi-Oh! Still in its infancy at this point, so was the player base. There wasn't a clearly defined metagame, as most of the player base would be formed of younger children, which meant that most of the decks around this time that appeared at game shops were collections of whatever cards players managed to pull from packs or built around their favorite monsters, regardless of how optimal they were. For the earlier periods of Yu-Gi-Oh!, a lot of the meta is in retrospective, rather than it being what was actively played at the time. That isn't to say that within the community there wasn't a semblance of what were good cards, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Would receive its first truly defining competitive deck, and with it, the game's first proper meta format. Starter deck Yugi and Kaiba introduced a medium power creep to the normal monsters that had already existed. Lajin, the new king of level 4 monsters, had the highest attack in the game, at 1800, and was an instant free of in every deck. Slightly behind it were Neon the Magic Swordsman and Battle Ox at 1700 attack. And while they had less attack than Lajin, with the lack of strong beaters in the game at the time, there were still free ofs in many beatdown strategies. The biggest shakeup definitely came from Summon Skull. With 2500 attack, it matched Dark Magician, but only required a single tribute to summon. Summon Skull quickly became the best monster in the game because its attack went over the common 2000 defense walls, and outclassed most of the 2 tribute monsters available. Even when compared to Blue Eyes, Summon Skull was often seen as the better option. 2 tributes was considered too costly for only 500 more attack, and while it would be hard to beat over Blue Eyes with brute force, the opponent could use a Dark Hole, Fissure, or Trap Hole for essentially a 1-for-2 trade. Another strategy that competed directly with Summon Skull beatdown was Dragon Turbo, as it aimed to make Blue Eyes viable in a different way. Flew Up Summoning Dragon allowed players to special summon up to 2 dragon monsters from their hand, as long as Lord of Dia was on the field, bypassing Blue Eyes' steep summoning cost. And only a short time later in May, the first limited and forbidden list was released. The 5 pieces of Exodia were limited to 1 copy each. Exodia was nowhere near as dominant as the other cards on the list. It was likely limited due to early experiences with the strategy in the OCG. Even so, this was, and still is, particularly notable, as the pieces of Exodia remains the only pure normal monster to ever appear on a ban list. If you looked at the meta decks of this era, you'll notice that they're overwhelmingly comprised of normal monsters with a couple effect monsters scattered in, but this was set to change with the introduction of the next set. By the time Metal Raiders released, the value of Vanilla's ruling through raw stats was being diminished. The card pool had grown, effects were becoming stronger, and players finally had access to monsters now offered real utility. This set introduced a wave of meta-viable effect monsters, and a presence immediately reshaped how decks were built. The weaker normal beaters fell out of favor almost overnight. Battleox and Neo were quickly replaced by far better options, and even some of the established staples faced new competition. 7-colored Fish arrived as another 1800 attacker, but with 200 less defense than Lajin, so it still held on to its spot as the best level 4 normal beater. Metal Raiders also broke past the old ceiling of 1800 attack with a new type of beater, high attack monsters balanced by mandatory costs. Jirai Gumo could swing over almost anything, but calling a coin toss wrong meant losing half your life points. Dark Elf had 2000 attack, but required a costly payment of 1000 life points each time it attacked. They also had the utility as a form of wall, leaving them in the attack position to benefit from their high stats without ever paying the cost. Effect monsters also began replacing vanillas in roles beyond attacking. Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest had unimpressive stats, but their ability to search out key monsters made them meta-defining. They added a lot of consistency to decks that had previously relied on drawing the strongest cards naturally. Searching for cards like Magician of Faith or Summoned Skull demonstrated that games could be won through card access and resource loops rather than brute force. With just 2 core sets released, a clear trend was already forming. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was shifting away from being a game of raw attack points, and towards a game where card advantage, searching, and resource management mattered. Summoned Skull beatdown was still the defining strategy of the early meta, but now it was surrounded by cards that could support, counter, or out-resource it in ways that were not possible when the card pool consisted mostly of vanillas. The next major shift for normal monsters came shortly after, the release of Tournament Pack 1. The set itself was small and mostly unremarkable, but it introduced a single card that changed the landscape of beatdown strategies. Mechanical Chaser represented another step forward in power creep. With 1850 attack, it surpassed Lajin by 50 points, making it the new strongest level 4 monster that required no tribute. Just like Battleox and Neo before it, Mechanical Chaser immediately invalidated the previous staples, and for Summoned Skull beatdown, Mechanical Chaser was now objectively the best level 4 beater. But there was just one problem: almost nobody could get the card. Tournament Pack 1 was unique from the previously sold sets, as it could only be attained from packs by entering officially sanctioned tournaments. Along with Mechanical Chaser being an ultra rare, this made pulling the card exceptionally rare, which was reflected by its steep price, routinely selling for upwards of $200 on eBay. And with most of the player base's major concern being math homework, Lajin, while being objectively worse, still was seeing a lot more widespread play. These videos take a lot of work and energy to make, so if you're enjoying the video and want to help support the channel, why not subscribe? And if you want to go an extra step further, why not check out my Patreon, where I'll be posting previews of upcoming videos, and you can also get your name in the credits of future videos. Spell Rulers was considerably less of a meta shakeup than Metal Raiders, but still was continuing the downward trend of the relevancy of normal monsters, which was best highlighted with the number of new vanillas coming out. Legend of Blue Eyes had 72 normal monsters, Metal Raiders went down to 51, and Magic Ruler had cut this all the way down to 40. And still, none of these normal monsters would replace the previously released ones, and the gap was widening with more and more effect monsters with powerful effects that could do a whole variety of things. Normal monsters were being thrown to the wayside in favor of monsters with effects. Mystic Tomato, Sangan, Man-Eating Bug were all monsters with low stats, but had a whole lot more utility. While beatdown was still the best deck in the format, many of the previous normal monsters that dominated the game were being phased out in favor of the previously mentioned shinier effect monsters, where now there were basically only 2 meta-relevant normal monsters left. But within the next set, this was all set to change. Just a month later, Pharaoh's Servant was released, and with it, we would get the release of Jinzo! The next shift in power came with the introduction of Jinzo. Like Summon Skull, it only required a single tribute, but traded 100 attack points for an incredibly powerful effect. While Summon Skull still had stronger attack, Jinzo had an effect that negated all trap cards on the field, shutting down cards such as Mirror Force and Trap Hole and effectively disabled a third of the game. Jinzo's release also increased the competitive value of Mechanical Chaser. As a new quick play spell, limited removal double attack of all machine monsters you controlled, transforming cards like Mechanical Chaser and even monsters like Guardian of the Throne Room into threatening pieces capable of ending the game in a single turn. Pairing these monsters with Jinzo allowed players to shut down traps while delivering massive bursts of damage, creating one of the earliest examples of an OTK strategy. While Jinzo signaled the end of Summon Skull dominance, the next set would deliver a similar blow to the strongest level 4 beaters, raising the power ceiling once again in more ways than one.
Twist.
Labyrinth of Nightmare again invalidated the previous best of the level 4 beaters with Gemini Elf, which had 50 more attack power than Mechanical Chaser, making it the best base vanilla beater, and also would be the last level of power creep at 1900 for a couple more years. While other effect beaters had been released, they always paid for their power through some sort of cost. This changed with Bazoo the Soul Eater, as due to a translation error, it let you banish any free cards from your grave, boosting its attack by 300 for each card. The requirements to pull this off was incredibly easy, and being able to boost a monster to 2500 was pretty phenomenal, as it made Bazoo able to stand toe to toe with even Summon Skull, pushing it even further out of the metagame. Another shift came with Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, which pushed effect monsters into the role previously occupied by normal monsters. Before this, normal monsters tended to have higher attack, while effect monsters were weaker but offered more utility. Kaiku broke that balance by having 1800 attack, along with a disruptive effect, preventing cards from being banished, which directly countered Bazoo's ability to reach 2500 attack. By this point, it was clear that good stats were no longer exclusive to normal monsters. While Gemini Elf still remained powerful, it was an expensive secret rare, and for many players, budget restrictions determined whether they could play Gemini Elf at all. Most competitive decks adopted some combination of Bazoo, Gemini Elf, and Kaiku, forming a circular set of checks and balances. Bazoo could overpower Gemini Elf could always beat Kaiku in battle, and Kaiku could lock Bazoo at space attack by preventing graveyard banishing. If you hadn't noticed, by now the only place for normal monsters in the meta was basically Gemini Elf. And while you might have seen some use of Summon Skull as a way to deal with Jinzo, their only advantage, being raw stats, was fading, and with new effect monsters taking away that niche, there's an increasingly smaller place for normal monsters in the meta. There's also another key part of the story with how normal monsters were losing ground. Hand control emerged as a competitive strategy alongside beatdown, quietly growing in strength even as Summon Skull beatdown continued to dominate early formats. Instead of focusing on raw combat, the goal of hand control was to strip the number of cards in an opponent's hand down to 0, then win the game with Yatagrasu, whose effect prevented opponent from drawing a card after being attacked directly. If the opponent had no cards in hand when Yatagrasu attacked, they were unable to draw in their next turn, creating a loop that effectively ended the game. Compared to beatdown, hand control represented the shift in the direction Yu-Gi-Oh was heading. Winning was no longer determined solely by who controlled a stronger monster. Instead, players began to value card advantage and consistency, which was a change that normal monsters could not adapt to, as their only strength, being their stats, seemingly was proving to matter less and less. In 2003, the competitive scene lacked a central source of information. The internet was still in its infancy, and most tournaments were local events held at game stores. As a result, the meta of what the best deck was could vary region to region, as a lot of the strategies would heavily depend on what cards they had access to, and even the skill level of players at their local game store. For many, it was still unclear whether hand control was better than beatdown, or if beatdown remained the strongest option. That uncertainty would change at the 2003 World Championships, where for the first time, Yu-Gi-Oh would have its first widespread tournament.
Upper Deck Entertainment and Konami Corporation welcome you to Madison Square Garden for the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship 2003.
To say now is anything but a decisive victory for hand control would be an understatement, with the top 4 players all using hand control. Beatdown was proving to be too archaic and slow of a way to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, while hand control was better able to utilize the consistency cards of Sangan, Mystic Tomato, and Witch of the Black Forest. You could see this difference in consistency with Ing Yu Lang's first place build versus Anoop Van Messem's beatdown build. Ingyu Leng was able to capitalize on Mystic Tomato's synergy, with being able to special summon hand controls key monsters with Don Zalug and Spirit Reaper, whereas Anut's build relied more on drawing whatever beaters he could. As for the appearance of normal monsters, out of the 9 available deck lists, only 3 normal monsters appeared at all, and only 1 normal monster in the top 4 decks, spelling a level of doom for normal monsters in the metagame as a whole. Gemini's elf usage in the meta would dwindle like its predecessors before it, as more and more monsters were being released that were either better than it or side grades to it. Within the very next set, Luster Dragon and Skilled Dark Magician were already both direct upgrades with the same attack and more defense, only hampered by the lack of synergy with Witch of the Black Forest. Another card, Breaker the Magical Warrior, was seen as a direct power creep of Gemini Elf, as it also had 1900 attack with its effect, but also the extremely useful bonus of being able to destroy one spell or trap. By this point, the reign of normal monsters was over. The cards that once defined the earliest forms of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Summon Skull, La Jin, and even Gemini Elf no longer had a place in the new direction that Yu-Gi-Oh! Was going in. Their only strength had been raw stats, and once effect monsters began matching or surpassing those numbers with meta-defining effects, normal monsters were pushed out of the game. In hindsight, this was always going to be the natural course of the game, as past the stats and level, the majority of vanilla monsters were indistinguishable from each other. So it was only a matter of not if vanillas would disappear from competitive play, but when. Disappearance didn't mean extinction, as while they could no longer stand on their own as beaters, normal monsters quietly began showing up in other roles. The era of normal monsters dominating through brute force was over, but the role in Yu-Gi-Oh's ever-changing landscape was far from completed. Leaving the Duel Monsters era, on February 28, 2007, Strike of Neos was released, introducing 2 normal monsters, Gene Warp Warwolf and Frostosaurus. These were pretty significant additions, as they broke the previous attack walls for normal monsters, and maybe if these cards had been released in 2003, they would have been staples. But by this point, the metagame had moved far beyond the idea that high attack alone could win. But the reason why normal monsters resurfaced in competitive play came from a totally different card, Advanced Ritual Art. Up until this point, ritual decks had always suffered from a consistency and advantage problem. To perform a ritual summon, players needed a ritual monster, ritual spell, and the required tributes on hand at the same time. This meant that summoning a single ritual monster often required assembling 3 or 4 specific cards, making the strategy slow and unreliable. Advanced Ritual Art alleviated this issue, as now you could send the required tributes from your deck, provided they were vanillas, making ritual summoning extremely more consistent. This was a much more cost-efficient way to ritual summon, as this took one part of the equation out, leaving you to only need 2 cards in your possession to perform a ritual summon. With a new powerful ritual spell, players searched for a monster worthy of abusing Advanced Ritual Art, maybe a card powerful enough to bring about the demise of their opponent. Demise King of Armageddon had a simple effect in letting you clear the entire board, except itself for the cost of 2,000 life points. While it had a powerful effect, it never saw competitive success, as it was held back by being a ritual card. But with Advanced Ritual Art and shackling its chains, this catapulted Demise OTK to be a top tier deck in the summer of 2007. One of the less intuitive strengths of Advanced Ritual Art was that it let you set up for follow-up graveyard based plays. Demise OTK worked by sending Insect Knight and Neobug, or alternatively 1 copy of Metal Arm Bug to special summon Demise. With those insect monsters in a grave, you could special summon Doomdozer by banishing them. With the field having been cleared with Demise, you can then finish off the opponent with a card like Megamorph to double Doomdozer's attack to 5600, guaranteeing a 1-turn kill. Using normal monsters was also a strength to the OTK, as Metal Arm Bug paired with Swing of Memories, so you could special summon it from the grave for another 2800 attack. This moment was a first for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For the first time since Gemini Elf, normal monsters were seeing a lot more widespread competitive play, and while it was a far cry from 2003, normal monsters were still proving they could be at the forefront of competitive strategies, a trend which would continue on 4 years later. 4 years later, the Lost Sanctuary Structure deck marked the next major moment for normal monsters. The Structure deck revitalized the Agent archetype and introduced 2 key cards. Master Hyperion gave the deck a boss monster with easy summoning conditions and repeatable spot removal. Agent of Mystery Earth completed the deck deck by providing consistency as a searchable normal summon, and crucially was a tuner, which gave access to the powerful synchro toolbox of the era. But what gave the Agent's explosive plays actually came from a decade-old card, with Mystical Shine Ball and Agent of Creation Venus. Venus could pay 500 life points to summon a Shine Ball straight from the hand, deck, or grave, and since the effect wasn't once per turn, that meant you could special summon 3 Mystical Shine Balls in one turn. While they could be used for a synchro summon, Mystical Shine Ball package gave Agents access into the game's brand new mechanic, Ixie summoning. When Ixie's monsters were first introduced, very few decks could consistently make use of them, but with just 2 Shine Balls you could special summon Gachi Gachi Gantetsu, an Ixie's monster that boosted your entire field's attack and protected itself twice from destruction. There are even more combos available with Genex ally Birdman. Venus could summon Shine Balls directly from the deck, but because the effect wasn't once per turn, you could bounce a Shine Ball with Birdman to special summon it, then reuse Venus's effect to summon that same Shine Ball again. Agents were such a successful deck that actually won the 2011 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship with 3 Mystical Shine Balls, making it the very first time a vanilla monster claimed the World Championship since Yu-Gi-Oh's very first Worlds. Strangely enough, it wouldn't be too long though before normal monsters found their way back into the meta once more. On November 15th, 2011, Photon Shockwave was released, which introduced the Evil archetype. The majority of the Evil cards never saw widespread competitive play, with the exception of the powerful boss Ixie's monsters. And as it turned out, the best animal that paired with these dinosaurs was actually a rabbit, specifically a rescue kind. Rescue Rabbit was a meta-defining card, as in 2012 Ixie started to find its footing in the meta, and there were more and more useful Ixies being released. Rescue Rabbit was one of the easiest ways to facilitate these kind of plays, as it could banish itself to special summon 2 level 4 identical normal monsters from the deck, paired with Evil Zordolka, which could negate up to 2 monster effects, or Evil Zorlagia, a walking solemn judgment. Rescue Rabbit would propel Ixie's monsters into the spotlight. It was as if Rescue Rabbit was a card tailor-made to launch Ixie's monsters into the meta, and with how strong this one card combo was, meant that Rescue Rabbit decks were multiplying at an alarming rate. As a result of how strong Rescue Rabbit was, it meant that now it was viable to even run 6 normal monsters in a 40 card deck, a ratio that has rarely been seen since, which of course led to a lot of bricky hands for the deck though. Dino Rabbit was ahead of its time, insofar as its main focus was on setting up monsters that negated the opponent's effect. As compared to its other meta contemporaries, Insector was focused on blowing up the opponent's field, and windups were focused on hand looping the opponent. Another card that was blowing up the meta at the time was Tour Guide of the Underworld, which functioned similarly to Rescue Rabbit, letting you special summon 1 level 3 Fiend monster, which gave access to Leviar the Sea Dragon. And with Leviar's effect being able to bring back any banished Rescue Rabbits, you could recycle the card for even more rank 4 plays. Another meta-viable deck that was running around this period was Heretics, where they all shared an effect that if they got tributed, they would special summon 1 Dragon Vanilla, which meant that the archetype lent itself well to making rank 6 or rank 8 plays, and form a board capable of OTKing with monsters with large attacks. With the deck's access to Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon along with Gustav Max, it was more than capable of dealing large amounts of damage within a single turn. It was too bricky to be a tier 1, as the entire archetype was comprised of high level monsters. As a result, pure Heretics, past being combined with Dragon Rulers, never really broke into tier 1, instead hovering as a tier 2 or even tier 3 deck. While not as instrumental during the Dragon Ruler format, an important monster for Dragon Ruler decks was Flammable Guard. Dragon Ruler was the undisputed best deck of the format during its prime, where typically their game plan involved spamming out the level 7 Dragon Rulers for free and generating insane amounts of card advantage very easily. And to make use of the number of level 7 monsters on the board, Dragon Ruler players would have access to Ixies and Synchro plays, of which Flammable Guard was the perfect fit for level 8 Synchros. While other level 1 tuners did exist, Flammable Guard fell under the case of normal monsters being used for their stats that synergized with the deck. As importantly, it was a Fire Dragon, which meant a Blaster could search it out. Being level 1 was pretty important as well, as it gave Dragon Rulers easy access to Crimson Blader, a card that hard countered the Dragon Ruler mirror match. Another normal monster that surfaced around this time was part of the Genex package in Mermails, a war-based strategy built around discarding and tributing water monsters to enable powerful Mermail and Atlantean effects. The package itself consisted of just 2 cards, Genex Undyne and Genex Controller. Genex Undyne let you send any water monster from the deck to the grave, and when paired with Atlantean Dragoons, this became especially strong. Dragoons would search any sea serpent, while Undyne add Genex Controller to your hand. giving you a clean plus tuning advantage, and immediate access to key combo pieces. And because sending a water monster was part of Undyne's cost, that part of the combo couldn't be negated, which made it only more reliable. What made the Genex package particularly unique was that Genex Controller wasn't actually used in any meaningful combo. It was only played because Undyne required it, forcing players to run copies of a vanilla monster with almost no synergy outside of being a level 3 tuner. There was also a risk associated with the package, as if at any point you ran out of Genex Controllers, Undyne's effect would no longer be able to activate it, and your deck would be further loaded with dead cards. Cards like Allure of Darkness could give Genex Controller use in your hand, but there wasn't a clear consensus on if the downsides of Genex Controller was worth it to run Undyne. But the use of Genex Controller wasn't the only time normal monsters appeared in the meta in 2014. A brand new strategy arrived that revolved entirely around the normal monster, used in a way that the game had never seen before. Normal monster so strong that for the first time since the very first ban list in 2002, we would see a normal monster get placed on the ban list. On July 11th, 2014, the Superstars Space-Time Showdown introduced Pendulum Summoning. Unlike the two previous mechanics before it, Pendulum Summoning was a bit less intuitive. To dumb down how pendulums work, they could either act as a monster or a spell, getting different effects depending on where they were played. Having two of the appropriate pendulum scales let you special summon multiple monsters at once, introducing a potentially explosive way to swarm the field with high-level monsters. During its initial release, the mechanic sparked some concern. Many players feared that with Pendulum's release, any deck could suddenly flood the board with monsters, but in practice, Pendulums proved to be far less splashable than expected. The early Pendulum cards didn't slot well into non-Pendulum decks, and the mechanic was easily disrupted. A single mystical Space Typhoon could destroy a scale, and in most cases was enough to stop Pendulum summoning. There's also the consistency factor, as if you're missing one scale, it didn't matter if you had one or even multiples of the same scale, you couldn't Pendulum summon at all. It quickly became clear that unlike Synchro Xerxes, Pendulum summoning wasn't a tool every deck could share. Instead, it was only effective in decks that were designed with Pendulum monsters in mind, where the archetype could handle these limitations, and that was set to change with the very first Pendulum deck. On November 7th, the set New Challengers was released, which quite literally introduced a new challenger to the meta, the Qli archetype. The Qlis were notably the very first Pendulum deck to ever break into the meta, as the deck revolved around focusing on Pendulum summoning monsters, which had various effects depending on if they were used for sacrifice for a tribute summon or were in tribute summon themselves, eventually building up to the main boss monster of the archetype, Qliphort Towers. But the heart of the deck was Qliphort Scout, normal Pendulum monster. While Qliphort Scout was a useless normal monster if it was summoned on the field, but as a Pendulum spell it was one of the best in archetype searchers the game had ever seen, which let you add one Qli card from your deck to your hand. While an archetype searching effect had been seen numerous times before, the search effect made Scout a one card Pendulum scale, as you could search for any other lower Qli scale, to then special summon 5 monsters onto the field, which was incredibly powerful, and unlike other typical searchers you could do it again next turn. It had a particularly nasty combo alongside Perform and Pile Trampolines, which let you return Scout to your hand, and as Scout was known as a soft once per turn, you could then reactivate it as a Pendulum spell, so you could essentially get 2 searches off in one turn. Ironically, Scout being a normal monster was also a good thing, as it meant that you could use Summoner's Art to search the card, essentially giving every Qliphort deck 6 copies of the card. Odd-Eye's Pendulum Dragon was also initially played to get another searcher for Scout, but as its search effect only activated during the end phase of the turn, it was deemed too slow and eventually taken out of Qli builds. The deck was particularly adept at running oppressive floodgates that could prevent the opponent from making moves. Skill Drain was a card that negated effects of monsters face up on the field, which barely affected Qlis at all, as most of them didn't have too many effects that could work on the field, and actually would be a benefit to the decks if it was used, as every Qli effect monster had a stipulation that if it was summoned without tributes, its attack would become 1800, which Skill Drain shut off, causing them to become big powerful beaters, making it hard for an opponent to deal with your big beaters, as their monster effects would be shut off. Another impressive floodgate the deck synergized with was with Vanity's Emptiness, a card which shut down special summoning, so instead, Pendulums had a unique interaction of instead of going to the grave while being on the field, they get sent to the extra deck. Which is pretty important, as if it was a monster that was sent to your grave, this would trigger Vanity's inbuilt destruction effect. It was also incredibly easy to turn off Vanities, as you could use Qliphort Stealth's tribute effect to let you return Vanities to your hand, then special summon, and then set it again to flip on your opponent's turn. With all these factors, immediately upon release, Qli was one of the best decks in the format. Their arrival also formed a rock paper scissors metagame with the existing top decks of the format, as Qlis countered Shadows, as Skill Drain and Vanity's Emptiness hard countered them, but Burning Abyss dominated dominated Qliphorts, as their archetype had inbuilt ways to get rid of spells and traps. The Qlis did fall off the meta for a short period of time, as their 2 floodgates got limited to 1 copy, and so for a brief period, Qliphort slipped into the background of the meta, but they hadn't even reached their final form yet. While the control floodgate variant of Qliphorts was the best build during its release, there was another variation, Towers Turbo. The deck was centered around summoning the deck's boss monster, the previously mentioned Qliphort Towers. Towers was a boss monster in every sense of the word. It was basically the closest thing the game had to a raid boss. It required 3 Qli tributes to be summoned, and once on the field it was practically untouchable. It was unaffected by all spells, traps, and basically every monster. On top of that, Towers forced the opponent to send a monster from their hand or field to the grave each turn, creating constant pressure on the opponent every turn. Towers was so good at its job that its name ended up becoming Yu-Gi-Oh! Jargon for any monster that was unaffected by card effects. But the Towers Turbo variant of the deck was weaker than the control variant, as it was hard to consistently get the 3 Qliphort tributes out on the board. A card that boosted Qliphorts back into the meta was the quick play spell, Wavering Eyes, which let you destroy every single card in the pendulum zones, and if at least 2 cards are destroyed, you could search any pendulum monster from your deck. This added consistency to the Towers build, as while you were destroying your own pendulum monsters, you could search out the scale, whilst also loading more pendulum monsters for a pendulum summon, as those destroyed pendulum monsters weren't actually gone, and could be used for a tribute summon for Towers. Throughout this video, I've mentioned basically every way normal monsters have been meta relevant for different summoning mechanics, with the exception of fusions. The next big moment for normal monsters was said to be one of the most widespread uses of vanillas in the entire game. On the 6th of August 2015, Brilliant Fusion was released, which aimed to support the Gem Knight archetype, as it let you fusion summon by using monsters from your deck as fusion material, with the downside of the monster having 0 attack and defense. On the surface, it's hard to see why this card was so good, and even competitive players had initially looked past this card during its initial release. But the benefit of Brilliant Fusion came in multiple ways. To summon Gem Knight Seraphonite, you could send any light monster of your choice from the deck to the grave, and at the time there were a lot of light monsters that synergized well with being in a grave. The second benefit was that the fusion monsters summoned by Brilliant Fusion gave you an extra normal summon, which was incredibly impactful, as basically every deck would benefit from the extra normal summon. And to top it off, you'd get another level 5 body on board, which could be used for follow-up play into rank 5 Ixies. The engine was incredibly splashable, as Performage Trick Clown could be used as the fusion material, which could revive itself from the grave, giving many decks a free level 4 body. But there was one downside, and that downside was a normal monster. To summon Gem Knight Seraphonite, you need 1 light monster, and 1 Gem Knight monster. We've already discussed the light monster aspect, but to play Brilliant Fusion, it meant that you were required to have 1 Gem Knight monster in your deck. Gem Knight Garnet was the best option, as while there were other Gem Knight monsters with effects, they were all too weak to be relevant, and out of the remaining normal Gem Knights, Garnet had the highest normal summonable attack, with stats that synergized well for certain plays. There were alternative lines, like the Lazuli and Jack Knight's package that showed up in Jared Stone's Monarch build. With that version, you could send Lazuli and Jack's Knight, and then you would get Jack's Knight back, and then use the extra normal summon from Seraphonite to tribute it and trigger Return of the Monarchs. Garnet eventually became the poster boy for a monster that you didn't want to draw, as drawing Garnet in your hand meant that Brilliant Fusion was no longer playable, as Brilliant Fusion only used materials from your deck, so if you ever drew your copy of Garnet, the 3 copies of Brilliant Fusion would become dead. The experience of this pain was so profound in the community that, just like Towers, Garnet became slang for combo pieces that would turn a combo dead if you ever drew them. While Gem Knight Garnet was ever during its peak, surprisingly, it still wasn't even the most splashable normal monster in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! That title actually goes to a different normal monster released the exact same year, one that ended up being even more universal than Garnet was. Right after the release of Brilliant Fusion, high-speed riders would introduce the new archetype, the PSY-Frames, a deck mainly comprised of hand traps, which special summon themselves and PSY-Frame Driver, which is rather notably the very first psychic normal monster. In practice though, the deck wasn't great. The PSY-Frame gears were clunky to use, and the gears couldn't really be splashed into other strategies. The frame gears were effectively hand traps that required you to run a level 6 normal monster in your deck, and with their effects being underwhelming, there wasn't much reason to run any of them outside the PSY-Frame deck, except for 1. PSY-Frame Gamma. PSY-Frame Gear Gamma was different from others, as many of the other frame gear hand traps were too mediocre to consider running a brick in your deck, or too situational. Where most hand traps either negate or destroy, Gamma was able to do both at once, which made it a pretty punishing hand trap in comparison. A well-timed Gamma can not only interrupt the monster effect, but also destroy it, often cutting the combo line short, leaving the opponent with a weak board. In comparison, Ash Blossom or Effect Failure could shut the effects down, while Ghost Ogre could destroy, but no other hand trap replicated Gamma's ability in the same way. Not only was Gamma great at disrupting your opponent's strategy, it also served as a shield for your own, because it could respond to monster effects activated anywhere, including the hand. So Gamma could essentially function as an anti-hand trap, protecting any plays that you made. If Gamma was summoned during your turn, this meant easy access to PSY-Frame Lord Omega, letting you rip a card from your opponent's hand, or in later formats giving you link material. This powerful hand trap did come with the usual risk associated with running a vanilla brick in your deck, because drawing Driver is practically useless for your deck. But the upside of having a hand trap like Gamma was such a disruptive tool that the high reward outweighed the risk. Its impact was so strong that it was limited to one copy, which effectively removed it from competitive play. The ratio of one admittedly good hand trap for one vanilla wasn't worth the deck building cost, and so the PSY-Frame package disappeared almost instantly from competitive play. Past 2003, all the normal monsters I've mentioned have essentially been used as a combo piece for other cards. But what if a normal monster wasn't fuel for other strategies, but was the strategy itself? What if the deck existed to lift the normal monster, not the other way around? And what if that monster wasn't just any normal monster, but the single most iconic monster the game has ever seen? Enter Blue Eyes White Dragon. After the early days of Dragon Rush in 2002, Blue Eyes never really saw too much competitive viability as a deck. Dark-type had received scattered support, including a structure deck, that gave Blue Eyes its very first synchro monster, but nothing that would push it into the forefront of competitive play. That changed though in 2016. With the release of Shining Victories, Blue Eyes received tools to let it actually compete in the modern metagame, and thanks to a couple of key pieces of support in 3 different products, Blue Eyes was able to stand toe-to-toe with the meta. Shining Victories delivered 3 core pieces of the modern Blue Eyes strategy. Sage of Eyes of Blue gave the deck a searcher to level 1 tuners and gave easy access to Blue Eyes. Whitestone of Ancients let you special summon a Blue Eye straight from the deck, while also recycling dragons in the late game. And Dragon Spirit of White acted as a way to both special summon Blue Eyes and also back row removal, but crucially banishing them, an effective tool to the meta decks at the time. And a month later, Return of Dragon Lords was released, giving the deck yet another way to revive Blue Eyes from the grave after using it for a synchro summon. But even with all these new cards, Blue Eyes didn't become truly threatening until the Dark Side of Dimension movie pack brought Blue Eyes and Alternative Dragon into the mix. Alternative White Dragon gave you 10 dead Blue Eyes cards in your hand, as it could be special summoned by revealing it, and while in the field it had the effect of also destroying a monster once per turn, letting Blue Eyes decks now deal with any problematic monsters. The original Blue Eyes existence in the deck was also unique from other normal monsters in the meta that we've covered. In many duels you would see Blue Eyes exist on the board as an actual monster, as vanilla Blue Eyes wasn't just used as a combo piece, rather than a stepping stone for a combo. While you still undoubtedly would use Blue Eyes for any rank 8 plays or level 9 synchro plays, with the new different ways you could easily special summon the original Blue Eyes onto the field, it wouldn't be uncommon to see Blue Eyes exist as a powerful 3k beater for an OTK. And if you added in other strong cards in the Blue Eyes deck, like Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon and Trade-In, the deck's ability to flood the board with powerful dragons, for a moment, Blue Eyes was actually the best deck in the format. But there was another aspect of Blue Eyes' return to power, and in some ways, Blue Eyes was a bit of an industry plant. While the deck was undoubtedly very strong, there were still other meta contenders that could compete with Blue Eyes for the top spot in the format. But coincidentally, after Alternative was released, Monarchs, Cosmos, Performance Pals, and Burning Abyss were all hit in some way on the ban list, leaving the format a Blue Eyes White Dragon sized haul. And for the 3 months after Alternative was released, it became the best deck of the format, where it ended up winning in a mirror match at the 2016 World Championships. Even Blue Eyes' win at Worlds was manufactured, as the event-specific ban list barely even touched Blue Eyes, but would heavily limit other decks. That wasn't to say Blue Eyes were a weak deck, but the desperation from Konami to make Blue Eyes meta was palpable to say the least. Blue Eyes received a new boss monster that was designed to almost specifically deal with the current meta. Spirit Dragon had 2 main anti-meta effects. Neither player could special summon 2 or more monsters at the same time, and it also could negate the activation of an effect in the grave. The first effect directly dealt with pendulum decks, which very often special summoned multiple monsters at the same time. Its second effect often countered graveyard activated abilities, a core element of many other decks, especially Burning Abyss. Eventually, Blue Eyes did fall off the meta, with the release of other faster, more powerful decks like ABCs and DDDs, leaving Blue Eyes' presence in the meta in a wayside, for now at least. Blue Eyes though wasn't the only anime icon to get their time in the spotlight, as not just one, but two ace monsters were seen play in a lot of competitive deck lists. And the next time these two normal monsters were relevant, a lot of people were expecting the game to completely break.
Left, right, left, right.
On the 27th of August 2020, Red Eyes Dark Dragoon was released, being a mashup between Dark Magician and Red Eyes Black Dragon. While most of the support previously released for Dark Magician and Red Eyes had been underwhelming, Dragoon was much different. A fusion between two of the most popular monsters with these kinds of effects was something a middle schooler would have conceived of, yet it existed as a real physical card. It couldn't be destroyed by card effects, it couldn't be targeted by card effects, let you destroy one monster your opponent controls and deal damage equal to its attack, negate any effect once per turn, and if you did, stack 1,000 attack. Dragoon, safe to say, was a very powerful boss monster that had an endless amount of effects, and for certain decks, Dragoon was practically unkillable. If you weren't running a kaiju or other routes to deal with towers like bosses, you had a pretty hard time getting rid of it. That's not to say Dragoon didn't have weaknesses with running it. Dragoon required you to play two vanilla monsters, which by 2020 standards was incredibly inconsistent, and a fusion card to summon it, Red Eyes Fusion, was in contention for one of the worst fusion spells ever printed. Red Eyes Fusion, just like Brilliant Fusion, let you use fusion material from your deck with the extremely restrictive downside of you not being able to summon for that turn, and this meant to play Dragoon, the only monster on your field would be Dragoon due to the lock. So while Dragoon was remarkably strong, the route to Dragoon was incredibly slow. But one card would solve that. Verte Anaconda was a Link monster released earlier in 2020, which could essentially copy any fusion card from your deck and activate it to fusion summon a monster. This card was ripe for abuse and was incredibly generic, as you only needed any two effect monsters to summon it, and most crucially when it copied the fusion spell, it would ignore the cost of Red Eyes Fusion, meaning you could use Verte Anaconda to summon Dragoon without the downside of Red Eyes Fusion, essentially meaning that any deck capable of two effect monsters on the field could make Dragoon. When a card was initially released in an OCG, Red Eyes Dark Dragoon was a game warping card where a vast majority of decks were running Dragoon or trying to run Dragoon in some capacity. The card's reputation naturally became a spectre hanging over the TCG, but when it came to the TCG, results were underwhelming. The card was still strong, undeniably so, but nowhere near the presence that it had during the OCG. Dragoon saw the most success in control decks like Eldritch or Subtowers, which didn't need to summon on their own turn, so they could play Red Eyes Fusion without needing Verte, but these cards were tier 2 at best. There were a variety of factors for Dragoon's underperformance in a TCG, mainly being that players were a lot more equipped and prepared for Dragoon. Dragoon's dominance in OCG hurt it in some way, as the release of Dragoon into the TCG was seen as a watershed moment that would break the game, so people were specifically prepared for it. The TCG also had the added benefit of two cards that did not exist in OCG at the time: Forbidden Droplet, which could bypass Dragoon's negation effect and in turn negate its effects, and other triple tactics talent didn't target, so once Dragoon used its once per turn effect, you could steal Dragoon from the opponent. And there was another reason why Dragoon never reached its expected heights in the TCG, a card that would take over Dragoon's place in the meta. Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer came out near the end of 2021, and was another card that had a weird number of similarities to Dragoon. They're both fusion cards based on famous anime archetypes, and just like Dragoon, thanks to Destiny Heroes, fusion spell Phoenix could be summoned with Verte Anaconda. While Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, or DPE for short, was not as strong as Dragoon, it was a whole lot more flexible in what it could do. It could destroy a card on each side of the field during either player's turn, which would synergize with how DPE's floating effect, which procced when it got destroyed, reviving itself next turn. DPE also wasn't as resource intensive as Dragoon, as to use Dragoon's negation effect, you need to discard a card for cost every time. DPE also had the added bonus of dodging the opponent's effects, as it could self-destruct itself, and then it would get revived the following turn. but the biggest divide between the two cards was the engine behind each card. To summon Dragoon, you would need to add 2 unplayable vanilla monsters to your deck, along with a fusion spell that you absolutely did not want in your hand because of its intensive lock, which also in turn caused Verte Anaconda to not work, as Verte's effect only worked if the fusion spell was in your deck. DPE's engine, by comparison, was a lot less bricky. It still used 2 soft Garnets, but the next turn Destiny hero Celestial actually let you draw 2 cards, and if you add on the fact that Fusion Destiny wasn't a brick if you drew it, and wouldn't require you to sacrifice your entire turn to play it. Ultimately, Dragoon failed to make a splash that it had in the OCG, but even if for a short period, Dark Magician and Red Eyes were seeing some sort of play in the meta.
Rebloom Sunseed Genius Loci!
Introduced in the 15th of April 2021, the Sun Avalon archetype was introduced, centered around Sunseed Genius Loci, which was rather unique due to it being one of the few modern archetypes built solely around the normal monster. The premise of the deck would be to use Sunseed Genius Loci to summon the boss monsters of the archetype, akin to growing a garden, but it failed to make a splash as the deck was just too weak. Another plant deck that was released around this time was the Rika archetype, which also at the time of release was too weak to function on their own, but they never gained any relevancy due to how underpowered their cards were. Over the year, both Rika and Sun Avalon would receive support. What's so important about how Rika attributed opponent's cards was that they contribute for cost, meaning that you contribute your opponent's monster without them being able to negate it, and through testing, a group of players known as Plant Gang would find out the 2 archetypes synergized incredibly well with each other. And so, the Sun Avalon archetype paired itself well with the Rikas, with the swarming ability of Sun Avalon to produce a board of multiple negates, paired with the powerful tribute abilities of Rika, meant that it was a viable deck in the new format. Another factor into the Plant Pal's success was that the dominance of the meta at the time, with Tearlaments and Sprite being by far the best decks of the format, caused a sort of smokescreen for the Plant deck to go down under the radar, relative to its power level. This led to advantage in any duels, as it was harder to deal with a deck that no one really knew how to play against. And Sun Avalon managed to prove itself, when it won both the 2022 and 2023 European Championships, being the first deck to win back-to-back of a World Championship qualifier.
There is the handshake!
Throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's been a lot of several use cases for normal monsters, and while there have been several cards bringing up the relevancy of normal monsters, none would change a game in quite the same way as the next set of cards would. Primites first arrived with Rage of the Abyss in October 2024, an archetype generically designed to support normal monsters. While there always had been one-off cards designed for normal monsters in mind, or even new archetypes centered around the normal monster, none had been created with supporting normal monsters as a whole. The Primite engine was highly valuable, as it gave many decks that used normal monsters a strong control card in the form of Primite Drill Beam, a devastating spell which you could activate if you had a normal monster in your hand or grave that not only could negate a card's effect, but also banish it. Cards with similar recycling effects had existed before, but they almost always carried a restriction to being banished after leaving the field, but Drill Beam lacked that clause. As a result, Drill Beam could be used over and over again for the remainder of the duel. Primites also had supported normal monsters in general, like Lordly Load giving you easy access to normal monsters in your deck, along with Dragony for Barrel letting you dump a normal monster to set up your deck for plays, or searching for Drill Beam. Primites as an engine mostly boosted every deck that used normal monsters, like Red Eyes, Sue Ships, or
Blue Eyes White Dragon!
On February 14th, 2025, Blue Eyes received a second structure deck with a questionable name. Now it once again modernized the Blue Eyes playstyle for the current meta. Compared to 2016, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had undergone several waves of power creep. Modern formats placed far greater value on one-card starters that could reliably snowball into boards with multiple pieces of disruption. And to accommodate this new power level of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, Blue Eyes had to discard the previous cards that once defined them. The deck now had many one-card starters to go into full combo with, a board filled with negates, and was a whole lot more consistent than its 2016 iteration. This time around, the core of the deck mainly focused on Maiden of White, along with Spirit with Eyes of Blue, to get into the powerful Synchro boss monsters. Crucially, the main components of the Blue Eyes cards are a lot more streamlined, leaving plenty of space for hand traps, even with as much of half of the deck containing them. Modern Blue Eyes decks opted to run as little of the high level Blue Eyes as possible, a problem 2016 Blue Eyes players had even at the time was with how bricky the deck was, given a number of high level monsters. All the previous high level Blue Eyes were dropped, even alternative White Dragon, as its payoff of destroying another monster wasn't worth the deck space anymore, and with its summoning restrictions requiring you to have Blue Eyes in your hand, conflicted with the modern playstyle of not wanting to see Blue Eyes in your hand, which went as far as cutting down the number of OG Blue Eyes down from 3 to 2. An important thing to note is while the new Blue Eyes cards were undoubtedly strong, the Primite engine is what pushed the deck from rogue tier to meta viable, as it gave the deck an extra Omni Negate with Drill Beam, and also importantly could bait out any hand traps that would stop the Blue Eyes player combos. Unfortunately, Blue Eyes' second time in the meta wasn't as dominant as its first, as even with the new tools and modernization of the playstyle, it didn't reach the heights of the current decks and was on the lower end of power. Primites also had a home with another deck, but this time, the normal monster used was a bit more, let's just say, unconventional. On the 18th of August 2024, the Fiendsmiths were introduced in Infinite Forbidden, an archetype revolving around Fiendsmith Engraver and its various fusion evolutions. It functioned as an extremely efficient engine, and could be attached into almost any competitive deck with very little effort. What made Fiendsmith so alarming was how much they accomplished with so little commitment. Off a single copy of Fiendsmith Engraver, decks could end on a monster of powerful disruption without even touching their normal summon, as unlike other cards, Fiendsmiths impose no restrictions on your game, meaning that as long as you could place a Light Fiend on the field with another monster, you were able to go into the Fiendsmith combo with Fiendsmith's Requiem. Even if your deck didn't play any Light Fiends, you could instead play the Link monster, Moon of the Closed Heaven. It had incredibly easy summoning restrictions of just needing 2 effect monsters, and was a Light Fiend, and from there the combo was live. In practice, this meant that almost every deck in the format could play the Fiendsmith engine. Fiendsmith's level of generic power warped deck building, as long with Moon of the Closed Heaven, any Light Fiend could serve as a gateway into Fiendsmiths. Players began experimenting with unusual and otherwise unplayable monsters just to enable the engine. Cards that never would have made the cut on their own suddenly found playability, all because they had 2 correct stats. And among those monsters, one card stood out, maybe the proudest of them all. Dustons were a deck introduced more than a decade ago, but by most metrics, useless, and at worst detrimental to play. There was one particular standout in the entire archetype, White Duston, which was a Light Fiend. A couple months later, things escalated further with the release of the Primite engine, and with Primite Roar, decks had easy access to summoning White Duston from the deck, along with the added bonus of the Primite package giving extra disruptions to the deck with Drill Beam and Roar. Primite Roar incentivized running additional normal monsters, since Roar could banish a monster on the field based on the attack of a normal monster in your grave. That opened the door to some unusual card choices, most notably Summon Skull, a card that had been outclassed since the very start of the game, suddenly becoming meta relevant again. Its high attack made Roar far more threatening, and being a level 6 fiend also created rank 6 Ixies plays, giving a deck access to more interaction. PSY-Frame Driver also gained more value, as it was another level 6 normal monster for Roar, but it meant that PSY-Frame Gamma could be played without Driver being too much of a liability. Alexandrite Dragon was also another viable option, letting you get access to Hieratic Seal, which was a card that let you return one face-up card on the field during your opponent's turn. But ironically enough, White Duston would somehow find itself power crept by another normal monster. At first, Deputy is just as unassuming as White Duston. It's not super clear why a monster which on the surface appears the same as White Duston would power creep it, even though it has worse stats. The main difference was its stat line. It's level 4, you could go into rank 4 players, or with a level 6 Bestial, you had access to Chaos Angel. That's the really strange through line of normal monsters in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! On the surface, they're completely obsolete, which in some ways they are. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards without layers of effects are usually dismissed outright, and yet normal monsters are the antithesis of that, but they still keep on wriggling their way into the meta. They have no effects, no built-in advantage, but across every era, they keep resurfacing. Not because they're powerful on their own, but because the game accidentally keeps creating reasons for them to matter. That's ultimately what makes the competitive history of normal monsters so interesting. They never evolve, but the game around them does. They find a new way to be involved in the meta. As long as Yu-Gi-Oh! Continues to go faster and faster with each passing set, it's a comforting thought to know that there will always be room somewhere, no matter how small, for monsters that do absolutely nothing. I've had to gloss over a few moments of normal monsters, but if you've enjoyed learning about how vanillas were used in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, you'll probably enjoy this video about how Exodia managed to beat one of the best decks the game has ever seen.